Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to introduce somebody I've not met yet, but we'll meet them together right now. And that is the lawyer who will be arguing one of the arguments, oral argument, for the fact that Jack Smith was unconstitutionally appointed. And that would be Josh Blackman. How are you, sir?
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Well, Josh Blackman, tell everybody what the basic points are in the brief and what you want to try and get across to the judge.
The simple fact is that Merrick Garland decided not to prosecute Donald Trump through a politically accountable federal prosecutor, someone who was appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Instead, he picked Jack Smith, who was a lawyer in The Hague prosecuting international crimes. The problem is that Jack Smith, in his current form, can't exercise his broad, unchecked prosecutorial powers for a couple reasons. One, the position he has is basically temporary. He was created for the sole purpose of prosecuting Donald Trump, and then once that's over, he disappears. And there's long-standing case law saying that you can't do that, that when you have these broad powers, it has to be a permanent position. It can't be a temporary position. Another problem is that there's one of political accountability. Jack Smith has a lot of power and a lot of independence, and he's not accountable to the Senate. He's not accountable to the president, and there's layers of what's called insulation that protects him. There's another problem, how it's funded. Believe it or not, Jack Smith has this huge budget, which Congress never really approved. Congress approved money for an old type of a special prosecutor that no longer exists, but never approved money for this one. So there's arguments that this is unconstitutional from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. And what we're going to have in a couple of weeks, Judge Cannon's going to have basically, I think, a full day of argument hearing all of these points out about whether this prosecution can go forward. If Smith is not valid, this prosecution very well may end immediately. It stops.
Let me ask you a question, Professor. Is there a more powerful prosecutor in the entire country of the United States with a national impact like this prosecutor? Can you think of a single U.S. attorney who has to be confirmed by the Senate, who has the kind of power to influence the nation? And look, the fact is that he's triggered all these constitutional provisions, the Appointments Clause, arguments about post-presidential immunity, and on and on and on, whether the Espionage Act applies to a president. He's triggered all these issues. He's got enormous power. Can you think of another prosecutor who has this kind of power?
No, I can't. Justice Scalia, decades ago, recognized the problem when you let one person be appointed to investigate a single person, not representing the nation as a whole, but targeting one person, and his name is Donald Trump. And it's like Inspector Javert from Les Mis, if I can use the Broadway reference. When you have one person in the bullseye and you have virtually unlimited powers, nothing's going to stop you. And I think that's why Garland selected Smith to go after Trump. And really the political accountability is simply absent. Garland can say, oh, it's not me. I didn't do anything. This is Jack Smith. But once you appoint this person, they can basically run amok and go as far as they wish.
There's no political check on the way in because of the Appointments Clause. And really, I would argue the Impeachment Clause doesn't apply to him either. The Impeachment Clause has never reached down to an employee. I mean, it might apply to a U.S. attorney. So they avoid the Appointments Clause, they avoid the one check that Congress has on the way in, and they avoid the check that Congress might exercise in order to move them out, correct?
You're absolutely right. We argue in the brief, which is on behalf of Professor Tillman and the Landmark Legal Foundation, we argue that Jack Smith is not an officer at all. He's an employee. And under the Constitution, only officers can be impeached. So I don't even think the Senate could, House could even impeach the guy if they wanted to. He's not really an officer at all. He's sort of exercising this power in this limbo zone where he's neither here nor there.
So on the way in, the Senate had no role. So what's the point of the Appointments Clause? That's number one. Number two, we know what the point was. The framers wanted the Senate to have a role in this. So the presidency isn't all this powerful, number one. Number two, they have no control over his budget because his budget's amorphous, as you just pointed out. It's part of the Department of Justice. So what do? They don't even know where to attack it. Number three, they can't remove him because the impeachment clause doesn't apply to him. Certainly, if they argue the government does, that he's an officer, and it does, but that would be an issue that's unresolved at best. So in other words, this creation is so not so aconstitutional, I would argue, that when you have a guy like this who's focused simply on a former president who's running for president, you got to make sure you check all the boxes, right?
Exactly right. And just to think about it, why does the special counsel exist? It exists for a conflict of interest. So, for example, when the administration investigates its own people, you know, if the Reagan administration wants to investigate Ted Olson, right, someone in its own administration, you say, okay, there's a conflict. But there's no conflict here. Trump doesn't work for Biden. This isn't like investigating Hunter Biden. They did this to shield themselves from scrutiny. They're saying, oh, you're not putting your opponent in jail. It's this guy, Jackson. It's not me. And it really inverts the entire system of government when you have this separation between the executive branch and the people who are throwing the leading candidate on the Republican ticket in jail.
That's right. You're right on. And the fact that this judge is willing to accept these briefs and hear arguments, it's funny that she comes under attack, that there's something unusual about her. These would be the same voices out there, I call them the TV lawyers, who defend Marchand on CNN and MSNBC despite his assault on due process and equal protection. We should ignore most of those people, well, shouldn't we?
Yeah, I don't listen to them. I don't watch that stuff.
Are you ready for your case?
You know, we found out yesterday we're getting argument time. I have 2 weeks to get ready. I will be ready, sir.
You're going to be great. We'll be rooting for you, and when you're all done, we're going to bring you back if that's okay.
Thank you.
All right, take care of yourself, my friend. That is South Texas College of Law Professor Josh Blackman, who is superb.